In a recent video, I talked about how Harry's court cases have potentially cost the taxpayer something in the region of £300,000 in his bid to challenge, first of all, the decision to remove his private security provided by the special departments of the police service, and secondly, refusal to entertain his suggestion that he offer to pay for it personally, with the High Court ruling just last week that essentially the police services are not just for hire. And less wealthy individuals might feel that that's unfair. Plus, it would limit resources, it would affect future decisions, and all sorts of other reasons that I went to in a great deal of detail in my other videos, which I'll link in the description below. But this gave rise to lots of questions such as why would the taxpayer be funding such things? And how generally does the government pay for such things? Well, the government on many levels will need to defend certain legal claims, particularly judicial reviews, which are notoriously expensive. And they have a fund for doing so, which is ultimately funded by the taxpayer. The government may have certain provisions in place for insurances and things like that, but ultimately, if all else fails, it's going to come out of taxpayer funds. However, that's not necessarily the end of the matter, because whilst costs, I understand it, have not yet been decided, it may well be that Harry has not only to pay his own costs, which are likely to be something in the region of those of the government, if not more, if he's hiring very specialist lawyers, which he is, then not only is it possible that he'll have to pay his own, but he might have to pay the government as well. And given the number of different cases that he's involved in, this might well lead to a substantial legal bill, and even if he wins, he may still be left out of pocket. Allow me to explain. You see, in England and Wales, the system is very different to that in the US. In the US, you pay your own legal fees unless there's a sanction to force another party to pay some of them for you. But that's certainly not the norm, the American rule, as they call it. Over here, in England and Wales, generally the loser pays the winner's costs. However, the winner doesn't necessarily get all of those costs back. For several reasons. First of all, there might be interim hearings at which they are not entirely successful. But secondly, even if they are entirely successful in one of those hearings, there may be a degree of what we call taxation of those costs, because there may be certain issues and certain reasons that that party is not entitled to 100% of their costs. Typically, they might end up with 60 to 70% of those costs. And speaking on this issue, Mark Stevens, CBE and partner to Howard Kennedy, a media lawyer, suggests that Prince Harry might be looking at somewhere in the region of £6 to £10 million on these cases, which even if he wins, he may only recover 6 to 7 million, being 60 to 70%, meaning that he's still going to be significantly out of pocket. But quite obviously, given what I've said, which won't be obvious if you were not before familiar with the England and Wales rules of loser pays winner's costs, if Harry loses these cases, not only will he be picking up the tab for his own bills, which could be, according to Mark Stevens, in the region of 6 to 10 million pounds, but he might then also have to pick up the other side's costs, i.e. the government and anyone else that becomes involved, which may easily run the same sort of figures, because judicial reviews are particularly expensive, as are defamation and privacy cases in the High Court. And this brings us to a very general point on litigation in England and Wales. Myself and many other lawyers will recommend that you avoid litigation at all costs, pun intended, because even if you win your claims sometimes, you may still be left out of pocket, because very often you will not recover all of your costs, usually something in the region of 60 to 80% of your costs, and therefore sometimes even by winning your case, you may still be left with what feels like a very Pyrrhic victory. Mark Stevens, when talking to the Daily Beast on Tuesday, said the writing is on the wall for this case now, referring to the government winning its argument that wealthy individuals such as Harry should not be allowed to essentially buy police protection, because it would undermine public confidence in the police and detract from their core duties and all sorts of other reasons. Although a ruling on costs is yet to be made, there is a very real possibility that he will have to pay not only his own costs, but the government's costs as well. And whilst nobody, to my knowledge, knows the full details, outside of his legal team of course, what his full costs are, they are likely to be in the same region, if not more, because he's paying for specialist lawyers, than those of the government. And many people might think that litigation is only expensive for the rich, the famous, and these very famous cases. But that is also not necessarily the case. We've known cases where parties are arguing over perhaps the share in a property, maybe an inherited share, which has been disinherited for one reason or another, arguments over a strip of land, or arguments over a building work that's overhung by maybe 2 inches or less. Either way, there are fierce legal arguments on both sides, which take a great deal of time, a great deal of investment by both parties, and ultimately somebody will win and somebody will lose. The losing party will generally have to pay up to all of the winner's costs, but usually about 60 to 80% thereof. But many people might think that unless you are rich and famous and wealthy, that those costs are likely to be in a few thousands. But that is certainly not the case. We've known many cases where the issues have been very closely guarded by the parties involved, and yet might seem quite trivial to a neutral third person. And yet those costs have run very often into the tens of thousands of pounds, if not hundreds of thousands of pounds. That is on both sides. So the total cost of those claims for both parties can easily run £500,000 to £1 million or more. So many different types of cases can run up significant costs, and particularly judicial reviews, particularly defamation claims, privacy claims, and those claims against government decisions. So in this case, I would say that Mark Stevens' observations are absolutely right. These cases are likely to be very expensive on both sides, and there is likely to be a substantial costs bill which is going to be borne by one party or another, inevitably when one of them loses. That is either the government's, which is ultimately going to be funded by the taxpayer, or it's going to be from Harry's pocket. And that may naturally have a knock-on and consequential effect to his home life, his house, and perhaps even his marriage. Because very often these cases and litigation can tear up relationships because of the huge amounts of pressure and stress that it puts these parties under. So if you happen to be contemplating litigation and a claim either for or against, I would advise you to think very carefully about what the issues are, how much you want to win, and how much of it is pure principle. And if it is pure principle, i.e. it is not right that they do this, I therefore should fight it, what monetary value would you put on those principles to be right? As a lawyer I once knew put it, how much do you want to be right? And what are you willing to pay for it? So I hope that's interesting to you. Please hit the like button and subscribe. Leave me your thoughts and comments in the box below. Check out my other videos. And in the meantime, thank you for watching.